welcome to Idea Generation, Mark.
Well, it's good to be here, Noah.
It's been a minute.
It's been a minute, yes.
So, I have to ask, how did your parents' professional life inform your career ambitions?
Oh, there's a huge influence on my career because they've really, it's interesting. My mother studied to be a nurse, and then she didn't practice for that long, right? As a nurse, because she started having the family. I have an older sister, Sherry. She's 6 years older, and then I have a twin sister. So, and then my dad practiced pharmacy. He graduated from Rutgers College of Pharmacy, where I ended up going to school. But there was a window in the 80s where, the economy being rocky, whatever it was, and I think them just getting kind of a midlife itch. I've remembered vividly my parents being very entrepreneurial. Like even my mom being the sort of homemaker, she always had an entrepreneurial flourish. It sounds, and it's not a trivial thing, because for a lot of people it's a great gateway into entrepreneurship, but I remember her selling Avon. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a very 80s.
It was a very 80s thing, and then my dad, I don't know, I think just standing on his feet, having it was kind of evident that things were hard working at this is before the emergence of the big CVS's and the Walgreens. So he was like a company guy at a regional pharmacy. And I think it just was physically hard, just being like the pill counter. Like I guess eventually caught up to him. So he watched my mom go out and get her real estate license in the 80s. And I guess he got some FOMO or that created validation for him to try his hand at it. So being in a house where both the parents had a side hustle, and like that was very much a part of the conversation in the house, right? The relationship with their work, our reverence for that, the impact it had on our extracurriculars, whatever. Me and my twin sister Marcy, I wouldn't say we were latchkey kids, but effectively we were. We took care of ourselves. Come home, took care of yourself, and made your food, and you had your chores. So I definitely think that was had a profound impact, just the general entrepreneurial atmosphere they created. It was always in the house. And then when they eventually created their own real estate agency, it was a very 1980s thing. This concept is going to be very foreign for people watching this, but there was a thing called call forwarding, right? Where the office lines would ring into the house phone. So in our kitchen, there was one side of the kitchen that was for the cooking and the prepping, and the other side where we were supposed to be eating as a family, but it was basically a desk for my parents. And there was the TV, and we'd be in the middle of dinner, and we didn't always sit around like in a sort of nuclear family, like sit around, but we'd be, it was dinner time, it was doing homework, whatever. Phone would ring, shut off the TV, get quiet. And it's like, you got to put on that, you pick up the phone like you work for me. So like that, hello, this is Margot Norton Realty, can I help you? And my mother's name was Margot. My dad's name was Norton. That was the name of their agency. Okay. Margot Norton Realty, huh? Margot, is that you? Margot, this is Mark. It's like, what? This is Mark. So that was very much a part of the atmosphere, and that whole entrepreneurial thing was had a big impact.
How did growing up in Lakewood, New Jersey, sort of frame your sort of understanding of culture?
Sure.
And also, how do you think that the role of suburban America is misunderstood in the cultural ecosystem?
Those are good. That's a compound question. Good question. What's interesting, funny enough, I think Lakewood's actually pretty interesting. I was very lucky to grow up there, right? I was very lucky. Okay, so why? right, let's zoom out. It's in the 80s. These are the Reagan years. Lakewood is unique because it was and still to this day, more so even, was sort of has a very large Orthodox Jewish population. So if you know about places like Muncie, Brooklyn, or there's different parts of the country that have these, by population, very dense, like Orthodox Jewish population, there was this sort of Tale of Two Cities thing that happened in Lakewood. And so Route 9, which is the main highway that runs north and south, everything west of Route 9 was, not everything, but largely middle class, more of a blend. There weren't a blend of maybe Christian, Jew, whatever, mixed population. East, very kind of classic story, right? The east lower part, poor. That's where more black and brown folks were, right, on MLK Boulevard, right? And it was interesting that was there, but then there was also this big contingency of like Lubavitcher Jewish, folks, surrounded by suburbia, okay, like Smallville, right? Okay, Jersey Shore. So you got Howell, Jackson, Point Pleasant, Seaside Heights, largely white, middle class, working middle class, and then this intense orthodoxy, right, where it was like two cities in one. There was the infrastructure for the public infrastructure, right? Like, that we shared the same hospitals. But then there were separate shopping for, kosher folks that kept their own retail. And even at the front, there's some parts you felt like you're in Tel Aviv, like the signage, right, of the retail stores and the strip malls. You'd be in like, okay, this is for the non-religious portion of town. This is the religious portion. This is the poor portion. So Lakewood was a really unique place. It's a really important insight in terms of impact on me, like hugely shaped.
And so when you're going to high school, I imagine all of these different places are mixing together and you're getting sort of a flavor from everyone.
Before high school, right? So here I am, born Jewish, right? Having a twin sister. My parents wanted to have our bar and bat mitzvah together, okay? And what's interesting is that the way that the spectrum of, not different than Christian faith in terms of there's a spectrum of orthodoxy, right? From Catholic to, let's say, Protestant or whatever, right? And there's in Lakewood, it showed up. So there was the Orthodox, there was the conservative, and then there was the Reformed. We belonged to the conservative, right, temple, but girls need to have their bat mitzvah on Friday, boys on Saturday morning, bar mitzvah. On Friday, boys on Friday. We're twins. She's 5 minutes older than me, my sister. Family, we're very much emerging middle class. My parents are, they didn't think it'd be fair to Marcy to not have family show up for her Friday night thing, because just statistically, the people are going to come for Saturday, right? They're working, right? So, can we do it together? Can we do their ceremony together? They're twins, and I don't remember the details explicitly, but I know that my parents took a decision to move from the conservative temple to the Reformed temple because the Reformed temple accommodated that. Right now, this is my first taste of like understanding the nuance of like race and culture, because suddenly we went from like the Reformed temple to the conservative temple to the Reformed, and people there were Jewish folks that kind of shrugged or rolled their eyes at like the sort of non-Jews that were the less religious Reformed.
So Reformed is sort of like
more liberal.
More liberal, a little more secular in there.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, there's like a choir,
Okay.
instead of a cantor, right? There's you tend to see female rabbis, right? It's a much more liberal, sort of secular thing. So that's one dimension. It was my Jewish identity in a town that was so shaped by, like, it was known as sort of a haven, safe place for religious folks. And here we were on the end of the spectrum, not very observant, okay? Culturally very Jewish, the foods, the sort of family traditions, you could, it's the way I talk, right? But not a kosher household, right? Not like the observant orthodoxy of like not eating certain things. There was like, shrimp at like our parties, things like that, that are taboo for some Jews. So there was that dimension. Then there was, okay, you're growing up in the 80s, the emergent cultural phenomenon that's tapping our society is this emergence of all the reaction of the media industry being disintermediated, right? So the alphabet networks, ABC, CBS, like we remember, maybe less you.
I remember.
Yeah, but you remember.
There's 3 channels.
We only had a bunch, like a few channels.
Maybe a PBS.
Maybe at PBS you get Channel 9. That was like the local thing.
WPIX.
You had WPIX, Channel 11, right? So suddenly when sort of media and the cable truck showed up, right, the world started to organize in sort of validated space for more niche things. So one of the things that emerged was, and it was, I think, a part of this, the cultural milieu at the time was hip hop, right? And hip hop culture was really emergent. And I felt it in my town of Lakewood because it was so diverse. And if you went to the public school systems and you were in your environment there, you were exposed to people that was what they were growing up with. And, and as 7th grader, 6th grader, 5th grader, whatever, you're just kids, you're into the cultural, you're starting to create your identity, right? You start to think about like, well, what do I wear in a school? And, that's the cool kid, or I want that girl to like me, or all that sort of social validation that happens in your adolescence. I grew up in this milieu of Lakewood that was like, wow. One end of the spectrum, there's the game, the version of Marc Ecko, Mark Malakovsky by birth, that is like the nice Jewish boy from Lakewood, the good twin, from Lakewood. And then there's the Marc Ecko, the Mark Malakovsky, who's like into art and was exceptional on a peer basis. I wouldn't say I'm that exceptional, but I was better than my peer set, or I stood out because of my affinity for art and illustration. So I very much attached to that, and then it was just this like, so my adolescent years going through that was sort of coming out of the bubble of naivete, of like, oh wow, like isn't every kid in America going through this? It wasn't until college when when you're like, wow, this was pretty abnormal compared to all these other people, black, white, and otherwise.
Just having such a sort of diverse community and a sort of shared milieu.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating thing, and totally off topic. It probably won't make the cut, but it's interesting. There is a guy who's writing a book on Lakewood right now.
Interesting. Really
interesting. That's really digging into this, because there's like some athletes that came from there, and Rich Medina. Like I grew up with Rich Medina. We went to high school together. So it's an interesting place, but it shaped me.
Now this is obviously in a pre-internet era. There is, I always talk about how like back in these days, me and my friends had a VHS tape we would record every time rap music was on TV.
Sure.
But you are getting interested in illustration and graffiti and airbrushing and emulating guys like Shirt Kings and Fade and these guys.
Sure.
How are you even getting exposed to the work that they're doing in Jamaica, Queens?
Well, that was the interesting part of the culture and media culture at that time. I think it's one of the reasons that to this day I have such an affinity towards like emerging technological trends, because I always had that kind of pirate radio curiosity. And I guess I knew that there was, and my peers, like they just had all the transfer of insights. So if it was like being at a friend's house and there's like Black Beat magazine and you're scrolling through the pages and you see LL wearing an airbrush thing, you know? If it was like, one of my favorite people in the space, Ralph McDaniels and Video Music Box, and that early, remember we didn't have a lot of channels, but when Video Music Box came on, like pay attention, so there were the signals. They were, you had to find it didn't find you. It wasn't like you showed up to McDonald's for the, Travis Scott, collabo, right? Yeah. So you had to find it didn't find you. And just, again, I think it's a universal story. You're adolescent, you're trying to fit in to your tribe, you're finding the boundaries of your tribe, you're defining who they are, and you are sharing your interests. I was good at art and, couldn't rap. I had friends that could rap. I had friends that could break dance. I couldn't break dance, right? You didn't really do graffiti in Lakewood the way that it was happening in Philadelphia or New York, right? Or in the boroughs, and in other properly urban, physical cities, okay, with train infrastructure. But we knew it was like the thing, right? So when you go to the mall and I'd end up at the bookstore with my dad and like that Henry Chiffant and Martha Cooper book, still like that was like a profound, you take like when I think about like moments in my life that were just like, like that scene of like discovering that, going through the books and finding that book and being like, this music played, all the color spilled out in my face, and seeing Dondi, across this Spider-Man figure, mounting the train. Like, what is this? What is this craziness? And then you connect it. You go visit family in Queens, or I go to Trenton, or go just, family function stuff, and you see the elevated trains, and you see it, and you're like, oh, you start to realize your place in this space.
Well, speaking of Henry and Martha and those people, to watch Style Wars, it's very clear that this is like a very insular community that is also very competitive. Yeah. So I have to wonder, like, both what inspired you to want to participate in that, and also what gave you the confidence as a suburban kid in the middle of Jersey to feel like I'm ready to put myself out there, knowing that this is a very cutthroat artistic scene.
I don't know that I knew that. I don't know that I knew it was like, oh my gosh, like, did you watch Style Wars? It's dangerous out there. Like, you're just a young adult. I think that was maybe what I was drawn to, okay, because I wasn't athletic. I couldn't play football. Like, I wasn't that coordinated for baseball, but I could draw. And so there was something about the extreme sport of the culture that, like, I couldn't skate. I couldn't do a cherry picker on my Hutch Trickstar, right? Like, it looked good, parked in front of my garage, but I was a big fatty, right? So for me, the art, and what's interesting is that it was always just a really sensitive, emotional thing.
I don't know. For me, watching Star Wars, I was like, oh, this is like watching pro basketball.
Right.
Like, these people are really doing it, and there's a sort of cutthroat competitiveness to this, and like, if I'm going to participate in this, like, I got to be ready for.
You got to be good at it.
Yes, I have to be good. I have to be really ambitious.
Yeah.
And you got to be ready for some confrontation.
I mean, if you play football, if you played basketball, like if you wrestled, if you, whatever your vocation was, right? So I think there was a little bit of this sort of like, oh, look how cute he can draw. You know, he's so sensitive. And then maybe there was something that I identified of like, no, I could be kind of, you know, I use the metaphor like the extreme sport of graffiti. Like maybe there was something in a culture where people were skating and doing BMX, and like it was a way to signal a sort of defiance and sort of radical independence, you know? And could I say that to you at the time? Did I know that it would have me do some stupid shit in my life later on and like learn those boundaries? I couldn't fully grok that, but that just was what it was. And I think every adolescent in finding who they are, finding their identity, getting sort of the peer validation, the self, the sense of self formed, you have to test those boundaries. It never felt, you know, I look back at it, would I tell my children not to do the things that I did? Sure, right? Because you get old, right? Mm-hmm. And you lose that, your prefrontal cortex starts to work, right? So you start to have executive functioning skills. But when you're 18 and 19 or whatever, 16, and that part of your brain is not fully developed, that's the beauty of life, right? That's what life's about.
So speaking of finding your identity, around the same time is when you arrive upon your name. And there's nothing, I think, more central or core to a person's identity than their name.
That's right.
How did you land upon Ecko, and what did that mean to you in that moment?
Well, it's an interesting, it's a kind of funny, kind of nerdy backstory, because it was actually given to me as a nickname by my mother, right? Because I have a twin sister, Marcy, M-A-R-C-I, I'm M-A-R-C. She's 5 minutes older than me. My mother did not know she was carrying twins until she bared us. Okay, it's a fact, right? So back in 72, when I was born, I guess, you know, they didn't have quite the, they didn't have all the same tests or whatever, and they missed that one. They missed it. So, but you look back at the photos and you're like, how could you miss it? My mother was like huge, you know, so who missed that? And my mother would go to the doctor and say, why do I feel kicking in my breast and in the lower portion of my belly? How is the baby able to do that? It doesn't seem, maybe, is he or she going to be all right? You know, it's just an echo in the fluids. It's just an echo in the fluids, don't worry. And then the echo in the fluids was me. And so that was like a nickname. That was a fun thing to share, like, you know, to kind of get me to blush at family functions. And then it served useful. Because here I am, it's sixth grade. You know, I got the Henry Chiffant, Martha Cooper Subway Art book. People have got nicknames. You know, they're using tag names. They're like the name is a part of the lore, right? It's like the foundation story, right? For the superhero. So I started using it. I just started signing things as Ecko. I was like, that's my name, you know. And at first my parents were like, oh, it's kind of weird. You know, I don't even know that they thought it was weird necessarily, but I just leaned into it. And, you know, it didn't become a real, like, I didn't realize how meaningful it was going to be until I kind of started the business, because I really, through my high school years, identified with that. Like, that people would refer to me as Ecko. Like, that's how my friends, people I was doing business with, airbrushing, like conducting business, I marketed it as Ecko Airbrushing, you know, and that's who I was.
How old were you when you launched the airbrushing business?
I started formally airbrushing in 8th grade. I got my air compressor and airbrush. And also another kind of crazy thing about Lakewood, luck, time, space, luck, right? Airbrush Action Magazine. Do you know any other magazine in the world that's on the topic of airbrushing?
No.
Well, the ultimate and singular magazine of the industry is Airbrush Action Magazine, published in Lakewood, New Jersey. Okay? So when I would go to the art supply store downtown, there would be the airbrush. I'm like, why do they have so many of them? Because he's down on by Lake Carousel, like in the back. And I would go visit the guy that was the publisher. I can't recall his name. But like his mom would be there sweeping the back of the garage. There'd be stacks of boxes of magazines. So what are the odds of that, right?
It's crazy.
So that was like, whew. So early shopping at art supply stores, seeing the airbrush, connecting the dots that that's a thing, that I want to make my own clothes for my friends.
And because you're seeing in Word
I'm
Up
seeing
and all these,
it in like magazines and in videos, and I'm confident that I could do it, right? And I remember, because my parents are entrepreneurial, they were afraid though, because it was a big commitment, right? Like buying an air compressor, right? All those equipment. I mean, it was probably $200-300 startup costs, right? Which at that time, so it's a significant amount of money.
Like a G now.
So like, it's like buying a kid a piano, right, or an instrument. Like, are you sure you're going to use it, right? So there was a little bit of that sort of. Is he going to really? Is this going to be like a summer dalliance, and then he's going to have all this expensive shit that we're going to, we're going to waste like good money on. I coerced my parents and had to make a whole appeal to my dad. I had an advocate in my Uncle Carl, who was like a very blue collar guy. Who was like, let him use his hands, learn with his hands. He was like a diesel engineer, diesel engine engineer. Very blue collar. And so they supported me, and I started formally with the materials in 8th grade. Probably come the end of freshman year, I was selling T-shirts for fundraisers, like for the school, like in the school. And I was soliciting it like all throughout, sophomore year, it really turned on. And by like junior and senior year.
How much are you making a month by the time, by the end of high
Oh my
school?
goodness, I don't remember the exact calculus, but I mean, we're talking significant, I would say by the time I was a senior, like going into that summer, the word of mouth had grown so much. I had such a sort of avid clientele. I probably was, making cash, at least a couple grand, a few grand, like on a good week.
Wow.
So there's some droughts, because I was when I went to Rutgers and I started school, I would just be like, I can't work right now. I can't say yes to any work. But it was always like this, like, oh man, there's that calling, and like the business was there.
I was going to say, so, you're making thousands of dollars in the late 80s, and as a high school senior, but you still end up going to pharmaceutical school.
Yes.
Why the hedge? What was holding you back from just jumping in?
Yeah, I think that stemmed from, we got to rewind to that period, right? So like there's a lot of things different today, right? So I think what's maybe universally not different is that sort of sense, however real or imagined, of following in a parent's footstep or doing kind of, quote, the right thing from an academic point of view. So my dad, who ironically was right in front of me, wasn't even practicing pharmacy by the time I graduated high school, but he went to Rutgers College of Pharmacy. And I was just, like I knew, like couldn't be, like I wasn't smart enough to be like a doctor. I didn't necessarily have the reading capacity at that time, or the interest or patience for reading to be a lawyer or something like that. So I just thought like, oh, this is kind of check a box. Like I'll make my parents proud, So, and I also thought like, oh, I'll get good letters of recommendation because my dad graduated there. It's probably like I'll be a little bit more of a ringer. And I was a good student. I was a good student. I was very active in like student body stuff. I was like class president. All that kind of, all that fun stuff. So I applied to one school only for early admission, and that was Rutgers College of Pharmacy. Why? Because my dad went there. Did my dad ever say, son, I want you to go to Rutgers College of Pharmacy? No, he never said that. But it was like an unspoken thing. And I think even, I look back at that period of my relationship with my father, I'm much closer with my dad today than at that period. Because I think teenagers at those years of like self-identity, you kind of like pull back from like wanting too much advocacy or coaching from your parents, So I thought it was just like kind of do the right thing kind of a thing and make them proud.
But you go, and then you continue to work on the airbrushing on the side.
Yeah.
And I know you have a moment with Red Alert that's very affirming to you, and I think like a real point of inflection in your sort of ambition.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, that was like, I think the power of sort of, to your point about it's cutthroat or being daring or having the confidence, you go to Rutgers, I go to Rutgers, my identity, it starts to kind of cure like glue or paint drying, like, okay, you're different than these other kids from your backstory is different. Like it's not better, it's not worse, it's just different. That was a interesting period because I found myself sort of like not fitting in. I couldn't find a tribe. Like, you know what I mean? I couldn't find, like...
It was a much more balkanized scene.
Yeah, it was much more... Yeah, that's right. What's the word? Balkanized?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so.
Like the Balkan states.
Yeah, Balkanized. Yeah, it was like vulcanized, like the sneaker? Right, yeah, balkanized, yeah. It was definitely more, segregated, right? And, the fraternities, black and white, there were lines, right? And generally black, white, ethnic, whatever it was, Hispanic, Filipino, whatever, like people sort of oriented in very clear tribes. Like if you grew up, which was a very like 80s thing, like and a part of like what I refer to as like convergence culture because of that media. When media sort of gets disintermediated, I think we start to become permissioned to like a bunch of things rather than being defined by one thing. Because there was a time where it's like if you were into skating or BMXing, like that's all you were into. Like if you're into basketball, like you slept with your basketball, you went out to dinner with your basketball and your girlfriend, you
had your starter jacket.
You had your starter, like everything was basketball, right? Like you knew the stats, you followed the college teams, whatever. So if you were into a domain, heavy metal, if you were like emo or goth, like you did not there wasn't a lot of interplay, right? And I just believed in like if something was interesting and you're curious and that I was drawn to invention. So like that was it for me. And I was like, oh, well, I can't really fit in anywhere else. So I just went deep on the art thing and the airbrushing that I started creating my own sort of mental model. And one of the things, you'd go home at Friday night, kids were going out to fraternity parties, and occasionally I'd try and just feel like this doesn't feel right. And like I'd go to, and people would just kind of question me. I had a lot of people questioning me. I had like white kids questioning why you're so wannabe. That would be like the thing. I had black kids kind of like suspicious as to what my motivations were, maybe encroaching or a try-hard or colonizer or whatever. It was tough to fit in. I had my little friend of misfit nerds, and it was a reflection of us. Like we were all a very mixed group. We were kind of the kids that were like, well, we're into all these things. Mm-hmm. You could be into The Cure and into Tribe Called Quest, right? Like, it's okay, right? It's not that deep, right? So, long story short, Friday nights, what do? What's the ritual? You put on the radio, get the cassette ready, the tape, it was like, I guess it was Thursday night, Stretch and Bobbito, right? But that came later, right? This is even earlier. This is earlier, DJ Red Alert, who is a New York City radio DJ, also produced famously one of my favorite albums of all time, done by the Forces of Nature, Jungle Brothers, right? Had his own management group, right? Those were like early Violator days. I think there was a relationship to, rest in peace, Chris Lighty, whatever. I'm not, kind of vaguely knew that was the orbit, right?
But also, this is a time when there is no rap radio. You have 2 hours of rap.
You got Friday night.
Yes, on the radio for the whole week.
You got BLS, and you got, 107.5, 98.7, right?
Yep.
And you just bounce back and forth. It's this flex. This is pre-bomb flex. This is a different time. And I grew up with that in high school, so that was a ritual. So my Fridays, I would go to college, I'd be the kid in the room drawing by himself, listening to Red Alert. And Red Alert would be shouting people out. And I just was curious, like, how do I get a shout out? It was really that simple. It was like, I want a shout out. And so I start to promote like parties at Rutgers. I started doing, I did like an event, like I guess my early entree to like Complex Con was the Hip Hop Bazaar, right, at the Rutgers College Student Center. And I had friends that were into hip hop, and it was like an emerging thing. And we were industrious entrepreneurial kids, and like we could host an exhibition, we could have performances, we could have a DJ, whatever. So I'd call Ralph McDaniels, and I would bomb Red Alert with faxes. I'd go to the Kinko's, and I would just draw stuff. I'd look at the liner notes of the records to find like where the street address was for packages. I'd research the location of the, slightly stalkerish, but not really. I mean, find the location where his studio was, where they was recording a show. I would just mail shit. And I would just hit them with stuff until, one day I'm sitting there on a Friday night and I'm taping like I do all the time. And it wasn't even like that's like, oh, I'm like hunting for him to shout me out. I wasn't even that conscientious of it, because I was sending stuff to a lot of people. Like I was doing that, sending to Tribe, I was sending to Spike Lee, I was sending to Chuck D, I was sending to anyone I looked up to in the culture. I would try to get to their management, send it to Red Alert, and he was like, yo, shout out to my man Ecko, and I just got this like ill flyer or whatever, and he's got this event going on, and thanks for the this custom airbrush. And like suddenly, the next day, all my friends heard it. All the people within my little, it was like, oh, it's like this little dose of sort of currency of validation, right? And that was like a contagion for me.
How did that, what was the battery that put in your back, and how did that change?
Oh my gosh, it was behavior? Like such a sort of like, it went from like role playing, like you're role playing, right? Like you're faking it till you make it. Like, you're doubtful, you're not good enough, and you're not talented enough, they're not going to see you. All of that talk that is just a part of doubt and fear. And then suddenly there was this sort of moment of, exchange of validation. However real or imagined he intended it to be, it was enough for me. And it was like, oh shit, like who else is sitting around here? Who else on this dorm, on this campus is getting shouted out by Red Alert? I started getting like that kind of level of confidence.
So once you have this moment of affirmation from Red Alert, and you're now feeling a bit more like an active participant in the scene, and you start making connections with people like Michael Bivins, and Spike Lee.
Yeah. And it was a similar kind of path. It was a similar approach. And I used to call them like swag bombs, where, I guess it was early viral marketing, right? Like there was no social media. I couldn't DM anyone, right? So if I could show them how much love and reverence I had for them by like breaking my back over a weekend or two to make, one of one item, and go out of my way to make with a deep intentionality that's going to show up to them in a way that's not going to creep them out. Very important insight, right? You don't want to creep people out. That it might result in them becoming aware of the space you take up. So, like, once I got the bug from Red Alert, who to this day I love so deeply. Then it was Spike Lee, and I remember he was coming to Rutgers to speak, and Spike was like super influential for me. I mean, like he, just everything that he was touching and saying and doing creatively, and running Levi's ads, Nike ads, to like making the films, the impact of the music he was bringing to us, right, from his films, and sort of deepening the exchange, right? So I did the same thing to Spike, DeKalb Avenue, Spike's joint, and I went and, Malcolm X was coming out, and my clients and my friends were very into Malcolm X prior to the film coming out. This was a part of the I think the cultural diaspora, it was a part of the communication of Black culture, and I'd gotten exposed to him through, I remember KRS-One, and the By Any Means Necessary album cover, and learning that it was the same picture, right? So I would constantly do portraits of Malcolm X. It was constant, request. So when the film was coming out, and I just read the autobiography, right? So here I am, like this Jewish kid in Lakewood, New Jersey, again, like reading the autobiography of Malcolm X. Like, what the hell is going on? Yeah.
So I know that as the idea of Ecko as a clothing company starts to come into focus, you pitch both Michael Bivins and Spike Lee on this, and for whatever reason, it doesn't seem to work out. And then you end up finding a partner in a very unlikely place in an Orthodox Jewish gentleman named Seth Gersberg. So I guess tell me a little bit about that, the process of pitching and being rejected, and then how you found Seth and how you felt, again, about, or I guess how your thoughts about partnership and what you needed in a partner changed.
So first of all, the pitches, it wasn't like Spike was in the room on that pitch. And what's interesting is when you go in cold, even to Michael Bivins, and I remember his aunt ran his Philly office, and I had a good rapport with her, and my good friend was a friend of mine who's also from Lakewood named Khalid Brock, who was a singer. And when I did the swag bomb for Biv, we put a cassette of Khalid into that jacket, right? And so suddenly I'm in it. That was another moment of sort of affirmation, because suddenly what was sort of this role playing, it's now one of my peers, my very close near peer, is now getting signed to Motown Records to be a part of Biv 10 Family Records, right? So things just start to change, right? And I had started, I guess just the level of promotion I was making around the Ecko business, Ecko airbrushing, even at Rutgers. I started to get more confidence, because when I'd have the exchanges, I get a call. I remember getting a call back from Chris Lighty leaving a voice message for me, like loving the when I try to get to Q-Tip. Like I made I airbrushed something for like a love letter to Q-Tip. I don't even know that Tip ever got it, but Lighty got it, and I remember that voicemail. So all these were like sort of little nodes of affirmation, right? And they were composed and building on one another. And you start to get this sort of level of swagger, confidence, delusion, okay? Where I show up in Philadelphia to the Biv's office. He doesn't know I'm about to pitch him. He just thinks I'm there with Khalid, and I just bum rush him with a pitch. So I look back at those pitches, even Jeff Tweedy, who was running Spike's joint, on DeKalb Avenue in Brooklyn, I just was a guy that walked in looking for, like, I literally would do that, to show up, like, looking, like, you know, like, who's in charge? And then I would start pitching. So I look back at that, and I talk about it in my book as if it was like this, I pitched, and I got, I don't even know that they knew I was pitching. You know what I mean? Like, so there's first that. Let's just stop.
Okay.
And like, I don't want there to be I don't want to be hyperbolic about it. But in my mind,
Okay.
in my mind, it was real. Okay, and in my mind, it was a no. Right? So when Jeff is like, this is good, but can you change all this ECHO to SPIKE joint, like Spike's joint? Could you change this? This is good, but if you did this, maybe it would be better here because we're not really doing this, right? And people weren't connecting the dots. And so I just, you're just sort of like in this sort of self-made reality distortion. You're confident, you know what you need, and I needed it to be Ecko Unlimited. That was the brand. That's what I had articulated. I wrote a couple of drafts of business plans. So it kept refining the pitch. So when
but concurrently to these pitches, you're being introduced to Seth on the side, and
I'm about to get there.
Okay,
yeah. I'm getting there. I'm sorry it's taking so long.
No.
Yeah. So I'm shooting blanks, right? Swing and miss. One of my good high school friends, who was a year younger than me, is a guy named Perry Landisberg, would say, "Hey, this bit," like he would actually he was a kind of a whisperer, like a online business planning. He was the one giving me the sort of the insights of, like, if you're going to be serious and you want an investment, like, you need an investor and you got to write a plan. You got to what's your plan? And his mother happened to be my art teacher at Lakewood High School, right? So my junior year art teacher, Mrs. Landisberg, was really influential on me. And she very much affirmed in school, like, my skills, right? So I had a special bond with them. And they would kind of like counsel me, He says, I got this guy, man, he's kind of crazy. I don't know, man, he's just like you. He's entrepreneurial, and he's at school. I think he's about to leave school just like you are, and his name is Seth, and you should meet him, man. He's like into real estate, and he sells architectural, objects, and he was over in Vienna doing. I'm like, who's this kid? He's talking about this guy like he's a 40-year-old man, right? Mm-hmm. And it was my future partner, Seth.
But he's 19 at the time as well.
He's a baby too, but he was just as delusional as me.
But he had like the rickshaw business. He's selling.
He was it was unbelievable. He was so resourceful. He was just like a creatively restless entrepreneur. Had side hustles left and right. Would rent or buy rickshaws and like run up and down the shore, the Jersey Shore, with all his friends, and they'd charge people for a ride, and he'd just like run on with these rickshaws.
So you're trying to pitch to people that you think sort of are culturally make sense,
right,
for you and your vision for this brand, and then you have this guy that you've been introduced to who culturally feels like it's not the right fit, and you initially rebuff Seth, and eventually, though, end up circling back with him,
yes,
and he ends up becoming your business partner
yes,
for 15 years or
That's
so.
That's right. Yeah, so Seth, I mostly rebuffed because it wasn't like a cultural misfit as much as I just found I was very intimidated, right? Because here was a person my age, or maybe a year older, who exuded a different level of maturity and smarts, and it made me fearful, right? Like, what does he know that I don't know? On some just chess game stuff.
Because he understood how to operate business.
Yeah, he had an answer to the questions.
Okay.
He had an answer. Like, I had questions, he had an answer, right? And when he didn't have an answer, he had the sort of brash belief in himself and in me, just like, we'll figure it out. Let's just do it, right? And it was a lot more. He was a very, confident, hands-on guy, and he looked at things very practically, just sort of Lego style. Let's just get in there and make the clay and not worry about it. And when you don't come from, not that he came from like tremendous wealth, so he was pretty self-made himself, but it was just not something that I grew up with, of like that sort of confidence of taking that sort of leap.
Yep.
Right? And, okay, maybe I look back and I'm like, well, my parents did, right? They left their careers mid-career to go sign up to do, something. But here was the beginning of my career, and it was kind of felt like, well, college, the implications, leaving college, these are big, like what he was willing to do. And this guy was traveling in Austria, and he knew investors that had, hundreds of thousands of dollars, like, ooh, an investor. I remember him coming to me with like a bag of cash, like the first bag of cash to fund our first major screen. It was our second T-shirt. Right? The first T-shirt I'd printed on my own at a local screen printer had like the red tag of Ecko Unlimited and the character on the back with his foot up, and it was like in the sole of his shoe, of his boot, was Ecko, and that's what I was like pushing as like my logo. But I wanted to print the multicolor thing. I couldn't afford to do it from all my artwork. And Seth was like, I'll be your partner. And after all that sort of me going out there, blue sky, it was mostly my own pride, my own sort of overconfidence that had me rebuking him. It wasn't because I didn't culturally fit. It was more like I was honestly scared. Because what I was going to be signing up for. And suddenly now I need a lawyer, right? Mm-hmm. A lawyer. I've never had to hire a lawyer. I'm going to need to write a contract. All these things that were really abstract. But he actually instilled the confidence in me, to his credit. Like, he was an important part of that network of validators and affirmers, right? He was a critical part of the equation.
Now, I'm curious, because this is like 91, 92, pre-Fat Farm. There is no sort of like the hip-hop derived clothing market does not exist. The only things that the closest things are Stussy, for example.
At a mass level, there were people doing things.
Okay.
But
so
if you were in the underground.
So that's what I was going to say. What were the brands that you were looking at as a blueprint, or something that you were like, okay, I see.
Carl Kanai was coming up.
Okay.
Right? Cross Colors was coming up.
Cross Colors, okay.
Cross Colors was popping. I would read the Source magazine, right? So the Source became like the new. That became, okay, we talk about when I was, back in the 80s, what was your vehicle? Well, you didn't have the Source, but when the Source came in, that was like the Bible, right? So the Source became a vehicle, and you'd read about, I remember reading about Russell's going to launch a clothing company, and, there was an emergent thing happening.
Okay,
right?
so there's the first kernels of that.
And just like style, like the vernacular of the aesthetic. The aesthetic was real. You know what I mean? Like in hip hop culture, like the milieu was projecting and building a aesthetic identity, right? Mostly assembly. It was mostly like a collage of other brands, right? If it was Adidas or Polo Sport, and Tommy, and so I felt like, Tommy, Timberland, I want to do that. It was, again, wild delusions, and I always had that. I didn't want to just be like a streetwear brand. It never occurred to me like that was the ceiling. It was always like, I want to be like Timberland big. I want to be like Tommy Hilfiger big, or Polo big.
Where did that ambition come from?
I don't know. Maybe it was just because that was I don't know, that I think that was just sort of, you grow up, maybe that was maybe one of the privileges of suburbia. I don't know.
I asked this earlier and we sort of didn't get to it, but what do you think the role of suburbia is in the American pop culture ecosystem?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a really good question. Increasingly, I think I look at it more like, what is the role of youth culture in American pop culture? I think youth culture is like a wavelength, right? It's like a Bluetooth frequency, right? And every generation has its own frequency, okay? And so if you came up in the 80s, when I came up, and professionally in the early 90s, there was a certain frequency, and people were tuned into that frequency. And it did not discriminate where it ended and landed and where it went to, okay? So I think there's an important role of adoption and sort of curiosity, cultural curiosity, our habits, our shared beliefs. What's culture if it's not our habits and our shared beliefs? Okay, really, that's really what it is.
Yeah,
People get really touchy about what the word is, and I get it, right? I get like from an African diaspora, black culture, totally valid perspective. But when we zoom out and we look at just culture, when we say broadly, in the middle of a park with thousands of, what are we doing? What's a pattern that's happening here?
Yeah,
what's the
ideas.
matching pattern that people are organizing around, the frequency? So I think Suburbia is just a place, right? I think it was important in shaping America's awareness. So Suburbia becomes an important geography, right, for this frequency to expand. I think it's a valid place. I think you're going to have sometimes in that frequency, the signal doesn't come in all the way, right? There's a little misinterpretation. They heard it through static, or they think they heard one thing and they heard another thing. It's not perfect, okay? But in terms of in terms of the cultural patterns and their ability to sort of extend, one of the great things about America, right, is that's the powerful export, right? That we do that, and it's sort of like this quake, and it just right, and it goes to Suburbia. It goes way beyond Suburbia. It goes into the mountains of Brazil, right? It goes into the streets of Japan, right?
All right, so you and Seth partner.
Yes.
He puts up $5,000.
Yes.
And you guys agree to print up your first real T-shirts.
That's right. Go to Brooklyn, to Apps, screen printing, and we print the first tees.
Now, I know that the color separation process was a very big ordeal that you spent an inordinate amount of time learning about in order to get the product to the place that you felt comfortable.
Right.
I guess, can you tell me a little bit about that, and then also sort of how that process worked as an allegory for sort of how you would approach things throughout your career?
Yeah. I think that it's a geeky insight, but I think it's an important insight for makers. One thing that naive, slightly delusional, curious path would afford me was the confidence. This is also a big validator of confidence, by the way, is your own your own development of your own knowledge as knowledge as a craft, right? So we rewind to that period in streetwear, screen printing. Go to Point Pleasant, print my first screen printer. I come with a 7-color thing. He's like, we can't print 7 colors here. We could do 3. Because first of all, you can't afford to print because it's going to cost you too much per color ink. And then the color separation process, which is like a fancy way of basically making the art ready for the press, okay? You take a piece of art and multiple color art. We typically, a photo is usually printed with cyan, magenta, yellow, black, CMYK. Not always, but in print industry and magazines, that's how they print something to us, to our eye, to visualize it as full color. In that period of style, it was kind of like a trend that was coming out of the sports market. If you remember, like you have like the Raiders T-shirt, and it would be like a trophy or a Giants ring, and it'd be on black. It'd be this oversized, look metallic, and it was so like ASMR and so like heavy metal magazine, like Chrome and all of that color on a black shirt. But you'd go into streetwear, or you'd look at what was early streetwear and skate. Everything was flat, one color, two color, vector, word marks, right? But my artwork was really dense, so I wouldn't transfer the t-shirt. So I had to figure out how to crack the code to do the color separations. At the time, there was a company in Houston that was called Serichrome that I found out through a lot of research, right? A lot of just going down that rabbit hole and just learning whatever, being willing to sort of discover and being bold enough to call. That's the place that the NHL and NFL are printing. They're getting their colors, t-shirts separated at Serichrome. So the guy in Brooklyn said, if you bring me the seps, you bring me the films, I'll print whatever. As long as I could print it, if it's, I think it had to be like 60 dots per inch, like the line, the screen weight. That's like, because the ink's really thick. And it's like, if you could do that, I'll print whatever you bring me. Okay? Stop yelling at my art department that they're not good enough, like that they can't do. You figure it out. Serichrome, call them, $5,000, $3,000, whatever it was, to do the color stuff.
Which is the amount of money that you have to make all the shirts.
It's like the whole budget, okay? And forget that, just the calculus of what I'd have to sell in order to amortize that setup cost of the setup cost was too much. So I had to figure out how to crack that code. So I went on a mission trying to just open my mind, I'm learning all about desktop publishing. This was before Steve Jobs was back at Apple, right? So this is how far back we go. When you get an Apple operating system, a Mac OS operating system on a PC. It was like a 2-year window where before Steve came back to Apple, where you could get a cheap Mac. So that's what I did. And I met someone at a trade show, this guy Ken, who had a brand called The Eighth Day. It was one of the first like marijuana brands, right? And he printed like these dewy, wet, green bud, t-shirts with big like marijuana buds. It looked like High Times. Like he just cut something out of High Times magazine and printed it on, by the way, not only black, but like on tie-dye. And I'm like, how are you doing this? He's like, I'll just do the color set. And he knew how to do it. And he was the guy who kind of became one of my early Yodas. Talk about like mentoring. And
you had to fly across the country to go spend time with him to do this.
That's right. Yeah, I flew across the country, and he said couldn't really pay him, right? So he said, look, you could pay me by buying a computer system from my boy because his dad puts PCs together. Okay. I'll hook you up with my rig. He'll make money on that, and that's how you'll pay me. And just bring me some New Jersey weed. Like, what do you guys smoke out there?
Now, I have to ask...
Which is frightening, and I do not endorse traveling with that, even though it's a much different day today. But that was like the first and last time I transported...
Interstate,
yeah.
I have to ask, this pops into my head thinking about this period. So you have, whatever it is, 6 SKUs that you're selling.
That's right.
4 of them are on black tees and not reproducing well. 2 of them are on white tees and they are selling like hotcakes.
Right.
Why were you not making all white tees in this moment?
Right. I guess just that delusion that I could do it. That's actually that's a good question. I think I wanted, okay, we go back to where'd you get that ambition? Right. When we talked about why Tommy, why Ralph. Right, well, my world. Okay, let's go to. You want to understand my world? Go walk the halls of the Ocean County Mall. Okay, what was in the Ocean County Mall? Right, there was a Macy's. Right, there was like a Foot Locker. So I was the sort of production constraints that brands that showed up there. They didn't have those production constraints because they were importing stuff. And you look at the inside of the label and you'd be like, Hong Kong, where's that? India, wherever, Korea. And you'd see these highly produced things. So my aperture towards what I thought was good at a product level was informed by the sort of the what was in the 4 walls of that Ocean County Mall. Which I reflect on it now, I was like, that wasn't really terribly good research. It's not like I was going... I went to Patricia Fields. And I went to the extra large store. I even sold to those guys, right? But my worldview on the things that I was buying with my own money and income were some of the things that were existing in the mall. So I think that informed the parameters. And I just kept seeing all of that chromatic stuff printing on dark. And it was like an obsession. So, and I don't even know, it's interesting, I don't even know that statistically, like, I don't know
they sold better or anything?
It sold better.
It just was, you just wanted to
It was like I had
that.
to be able to do it, and I had like it was like a technical achievement for me. It was like an achievement of my craft to be able to say I could do that.
So you start with these, this array of T-shirts that are essentially mining your sketchbooks with graphics.
Yeah.
At what point do you start contemplating in a really articulate way what the brand of Ecko Unlimited means and what that sort of relationship with the consumer is about?
Mm-hmm. I think I wasn't able to really. I think I understood the convergence thing early on. I couldn't articulate it, and I was very intimidated. I was often ridiculed by my peers for the point of view that I had on the brand, because there was a certain orthodoxy happening within emerging streetwear, right? I remember that was like, Stussy was the king, but he was already like the mall brand, right? Stussy brand. I remember being at a trade show and all of my near peers and not so near peers that were bigger commercial brands started encroaching a little bit on the aesthetic of what I was doing and what some of my near peers were doing. So let's say the near peers were Tribal, Con Art, 555 Soul, right? Folks within that orbit, Fat Farm. And I saw a brand like Jenko, like Jean Company, which was like all about rave culture, like wide leg jeans. I didn't fully get it. I knew that they were bigger, right? And I maybe had a chip on my shoulder about like the fact that they were bigger than us. But I started seeing them do like graffiti style hand mark illustrations with the word. And I'm walking that trade show and I'm looking at all the brands that I admire. There's a Ralph Lauren booth there. And there's a giant polo horse. There's a Lacoste alligator. There's the Timberland tree. And I realize I go back into our little section, our little area of this trade show floor, and everybody's sort of barking or kind of shooting from the same angle, right? Where everyone's just doing word marks. I'm like, that seems like a missed opportunity. Like, what would my logo be? Was it really that naive of a question? Like, what would my logo be? I need a logo. I need a mascot, And I went on that pursuit, and it became sort of an organizing framework for the brand, right? And again, going back to role-playing, right? Fake it till you make it. It was a little bit of, well, if Ralph could do it, I could do it, right? If Mr. Lacoste, whoever invented that, could do it with the alligator, I could do it. And it really just, that became the organizing framework. And then the aspiration towards trying to elevate beyond just the printed t-shirt. So the obsession that was printing on black and printing my art as I meant it, right? And all the novelty stuff I could do with the screen, like with the screen printer and basically really differentiate technically. This is like a technological advantage for my peers. They were like, how is he doing that? And it became like other people were doing photo prints, right? The other technical feat was, okay, this polo jacket I'm wearing, I want a jacket like this. And like, where does this shit get made? Now at that time, the only brands in my kind of cohort that were doing things at that level of manufacturing quality were the snowboard brands. The snowboard brands were doing it. So like Burton, a lot of, I can't even remember all the great names, but there's so many emergent names of snowboarding brands that did like the seam seal, tape seam, the technical shit, right? Gore-Tex and, you know, all of that 3M. And I'm like, I want to do that. So it was really, again, all right, the role playing. All right, well, you need a mascot. Well, you need to make stuff in Hong Kong because that's apparently where you make it. And then I went down a rabbit hole seeking production partners to do that.
I remember you telling me one time about your first foray into denim and how that went left very quickly.
Yeah.
Could you tell me that story?
Yeah, the where the buttons all fell off. You're talking about, yeah. So that was like a Made in America story, which, by the way, it's interesting because today now the world dynamics, world culture, manufacturing, there's a much different dynamism today, and I do believe I look back on that period of you know, I was lucky to see sort of the last days of American manufacturing. And pretty much when I started the business, even in America, Levi's was probably still doing 50% of their manufacturing here in the States. So you can make denim here in the States. And the West Coast, to this day, is still known for some of the better wash houses, but increasingly less and less and less is made here, which hopefully that's going to change. Yeah, I had my first foray into denim, and so I have the aesthetic ambition of like the snowboard brands, right? Bells and whistles on the gear, you know, metal rivets and beautiful zipper pulls and jeans. I'm not just making like some Levi's bullshit. So I'm gonna have like extra embroideries and you know. So I try to do that in the States, and I shipped my first batch of denim, and grand opening, grand closing. You know, those shank buttons, they all popped off, and massive returns, you know, of product. And that would not be the first or the last time, you know. You're in the crafts business. It's an arts and crafts business. And the concepts like quality control and, you know, QCing, and really having embedded people in the facility, the sort of engineering side, that sort of the delta between I could do it and then here's the product. That delta, that sort of like productionism delta, like, oh, I could conceive it, therefore it can be, right? I didn't have the team, my sister Marcy.
Marcy's now been added to the business.
In the business. We didn't have the engineering wherewithal. And that's when it really started to affirm for me, like, oh, there is a part of this trade that is about understanding the mousetrap of the design of the infrastructure and what that means to build and how to design that. And that became another obsession.
Well, in a sort of tangentially related story, I know that you also around the same time, you know, learned the very hard way about other practicalities within the business. Mm-hmm. You guys go to Magic, I guess you get $2 million worth of orders, which is a moment you talk about in your book, literally crying on the phone with your mom.
Yeah.
And you very, very quickly realize that the difference between getting $2 million worth of orders and then fulfilling $2 million worth of orders and maintaining even a hair of margin are completely different things. Tell me a little bit about what was that realization like, and then how did that inform how you guys move forward?
Well, that was kind of like that show, which is interesting because it was very affirming, because it was one of the first shows that I had a wider collection of like cut and sewn and more styled product that I was able to sort of design and engineer from sketch to completion. I also had tremendous vulnerability because I was very dependent. I was not self-reliant. I was very dependent on kind of shady manufacturing partners. Naive about it, not knowing how to finance it. And then there's the other bit, like, okay, you get it made, it comes in, now you gotta keep an inventory of it, you gotta ship it, you gotta deal with returns, all those complexities. I think, you know, when I acknowledge that in my life and in my career, and I reflect on that moment, and even in the insight in the book, it comes a little bit with reflection, right? Because in that moment of like hanging up the phone, I can't believe we got $2 million in paper, whatever it was. Like, that was so real. And I tell young people today, like people that are, let's say, fundraising, or they're starting a business, and they think like, okay, they closed that round of funding, they think they've achieved. It's like, man, you haven't even started, you know. I think what and not to take anything away from the achievement of fundraising, because it's a real material and valid achievement, but the thing is it's getting into relationship with the problems, right? Like for me, you know, like the idea of Ecko Unlimited, the idea of the Rhino, right? That was sort of an intention setter. That was the romantic sort of frame to role play, to visualize a future, right? But then there's the problem of having to actually make it real. And you have to love the problem as much as you love the idea, right? You have to love the problem even more so, and get enriched by the reality that there will be problems to realize the idea, and that there's actually really creative moments of eureka that you start to learn to gratify yourself, that are not the same as my right hand drawing an illustration or painting, and that sort of, okay, whatever adrenaline rush or satisfaction you get from completion. Not the same, it's not the, but it is a sort of something going off chemically in your body that feels like, oh, I got through that, right? I got through that. And you start to learn to look for that and become like obsessed about that.
Well, the hard goods business can be incredibly brutal in so much as you get these orders, and then you have to put up capital in order to create the goods and then fulfill them, and then you have to wait for an extended period for either returns, so you maybe not get all the money back that you've spent to create the stuff, or you do get it back and it's 180 days after the last day of sale, and so now we're talking 6-9 months. And I know that in that period, Ecko went through a lot of really challenging financial moments.
Sure.
And I'm curious, you know, how did you and Seth deal with that tactically? Just borrowing from Peter to pay Paul, and also how did you manage that emotionally as someone who I know is sensitive and who is an artist and cares deeply both about the brand and also about the team that you're managing? Sure.
Well, what's interesting is that here's the interesting thing, and I don't know how true it is today, although I do believe that it still stands to be relatively true. Although I don't know that our banks and our banking infrastructure will bet on it quite the way that they did in the years that I came up. The one thing about, like, you asked a question before about when did you get to know that you had a brand, is like when you start to be able to lend the IP, you start to take a loan against your own IP. That's when you know you have, like I was able to pledge the trademarks as one of the things besides also personal guarantees. Let's be clear. Like personally being on the hook, so that there was no escape route. There was no bankruptcy. You couldn't parachute out. Like you personally are signing up for these lines of credit. But there's an interesting insight that I remember oftentimes and boldly, like taking massive lines of credit to fund. So what were the assets that I had? I had inventory that maybe had a long shelf life, like basic core items. I could pledge that. So if I went upside down, the bank takes that. I could pledge the IP, the trademarks, and man, they were getting high every season, more and more high valued, right? But it was crazy because we were more and more overextending ourselves, right? Like to go from that sort of role playing, make believe to the real, that space takes a tremendous amount of cash, because and especially at that time, we go back to, there was no e-commerce, okay? So distribution was as good as what was, I talk about the Ocean County Mall. That might as well have been the internet, right? That might as well have been Hypebeast, because there was no Hypebeast, right? Mm-hmm. That was the point of distribution. So Macy's for me was that. And the mechanics of landing a brand at that scale, and I was just naive and stupid, Like in retrospect, I should have been more patient. Okay, I could have been more patient now. I don't regret it, but that sort of leaping from, RPG role playing to real, right, and going from being meaningful to the buy side takes a tremendous amount of capital and capital risk to fill those inventory pipes. You're filling shelves, right? You have to fill shelves. You have to be able to replenish all that stuff. So I don't know that I'm answering the question, but I guess all that to say that it's an interesting thing to sort of meditate on, because now, today, there's so much direct to consumer, right?
I was going to say, you look at a brand like Kith and what Ronnie's done,
Yeah.
it is sort of completely vertically integrated.
Yeah.
And it's a much simpler, higher margin operation than what was even, it was simply not available to a brand like Ecko in 1997.
And also the level of collaborations weren't at the fever pitch that when Ronnie, who's a very gifted merchant, the distribution of the sort of asymmetric marketing of hitching your wagon to someone else's star, that was not the flavor, of like, there were signals of it, but not at a level of scale, right? If scale was important, you could do it, and you could do like a collabo, but it was not like a scale thing until really e-commerce blew the doors off of that.
You guys dabbled in it, I remember with X-Men T-shirts. And
Marvel,
with
Playboy,
other people's IP.
all sorts of stuff. We did all sorts of collabos, but it almost came, and that was like a very ad hoc thing. I don't even know that we called it collaborations. We had like the Blue Rhino collection, and I was licensing everything from, Von Bodie Cheech Wizard to Star Wars to Marvel to all sorts of really fun stuff. And I go back and look at some of that stuff. It was fun. It was fun.
Okay,
and we became a distribution channel for them, right?
Yes.
Because the aesthetic vernacular of those brands, that was a stretch for them out of their comfort zone. They didn't do things that looked like, out of their style guides were so constrained on like, what is Hasbro doing? What is Kenner doing? What is, McDonald's doing? So we took those brands, and I didn't do it alone. There were my peers that we brought it, but it spoke to that convergence, right? It spoke to that, like, these things can interrelate.
To my question though about sort of like these moments where you are borrowing from one to pay the other.
Yeah.
I know that you guys had to do some fairly extraordinary and somewhat ethically dubious things in order to, make payments be delayed or, borrow credit cards from employees and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about, what was it like both, in the conversations with you and Seth about how you're going to keep this thing on the treadmill, and also how are you feeling inside?
Oh, it's brutal. Yeah, it's not. It makes for a funny anecdote, in a sort of midlife crisis book, about putting your spit on your thumb and rubbing over the barcode of the check, which conveniently obscures the number so that when the check gets run and processed at the bank, it's gonna slow the payments down by a few days because it had to be manually done. Now today, I don't think that's the case anymore with direct to digital depositing, but we would do things like that, and we were upside down. That was the crazy dichotomy of this, and this sort of like this was a voyage of tremendous self-sacrifice, mental health, physical well-being, financial sacrifice, relational sacrifice, ethical sacrifice. A lot of things you do that, like, you look back on now. I look back on with age, and I'm like, I don't know that I would operate that way, but again, maybe the naiveness, the role playing, it just was it's a survival thing, but all of that, being underwater, having the sales volume the explosive sort of perception, right, that the brand is in a great state, but then the reality that you're upside down. And I think I spent the majority of my career, it was a tremendous, like, humbling thing, right? So, and I say, like, perception is not reality. Even though every PR person I've ever met and every PR whisperer, like, will be like, oh, it's perception, it's gonna be a great look. And, you know, like, no, it's a good look is sleeping good at night. You know what I mean? Like, or as best as you can, because you're likely not to sleep well, right? Just with the normal woes of the world and the normal statistical woes of the world and of life, right? So whatever you self-induce, no, like, reality is reality. And, you know, so I look back on that, and I could say that between me and Seth, it was contentious, you know, but it was always fair. I look at it and it was like we were both learning. We were both each other's, one another's, and for my sister Marcy, who was critical part of the equation, each other's university. We were the degrees we never got formally. You know, we were each other's educators. We were each other's assessors, right? And I have very visual and vivid moments of, you know, I mean, Seth was important because, like, on one hand, I remember one trade show you asked about, like, this is the interesting insight about skate in relationship to hip hop, in relationship to streetwear. I remember we printed our first skate decks, and we're at the Action Sports Retailer Show, ASR, in San Diego. Might have been in the New York one. I can't remember where it was. I want to say, I can't remember, wherever it was, okay? And the booth was pretty cool, and I was really proud of these skate decks, and I had people skating for us, right? Like, I don't know, why not? Kids were coming into my warehouse. My good friends, some people are still like family to me that I grew up with, that, like, Mark, we should do a skate team. Mark, let's sponsor, like, a skate event. You know, my good friend Eric Monroe, the photographer, used to do, like, a skating event all throughout Jersey. I would sponsor it. It was cool, dope. This is ill. Or, you know, like, but I remember being at that trade show, and there's this kid that came up to me and was ready, wanted to fight me. Started to, like, really get, like, in my face about, like, you're a fuck boy, fuck you, you poser, you don't even skate, da-da-da, you have no business making skate decks. And I remember Seth, the little ass Seth, I shouldn't say little ass, but, you know, he's little, but he was brolic, like, he was a wrestler, right? I remember him getting in between us, and, man, he just like, made that kid back down. So, like, there's a tremendous love I have for him, even though the relationship, the professional relationship, was not without its fits and its starts and differences, and but it was brotherly, and to this day I've stayed in touch with him. You know, I love and respect him, and he was an important part of my story and my journey. But we weren't without our moments, and to your point, in terms of, he taught me to be like, if there was no Seth, I might not have built the endurance and the sense of what my capacity was, right? He pushed and stretched me in a way that no educator in my life ever did. No other professional experience really ever did. So I value it deeply.
To that point, I know around that time, you guys did a deal to take on some capital that was a huge risk. You gambled on yourself, and it put you and your ownership of the brand in a very precarious state.
Yes.
And I guess, what was the conversation that you two had, or the three of you and Marcy, reconciling how that was going to work, and what was the game plan to get to the end of that, maintaining ownership of the company?
Yeah. It was very, very, again, like, in retrospect, I think it was...
Can you explain the deal just a little bit? Since I didn't really...
What you're talking about, which deal?
This was the one where you basically you borrow the money, and you have 3 years to pay it back, and if You don't pay it back. They take the money. They take the company.
Right. This was like during the financial crisis, like what I talk about.
No. This is earlier. This is more like 2000, early 2000s, I think.
Oh, when I did that bad production deal, I think.
Is that what it was?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, this is sort of it almost doesn't matter because they're similar frames, right?
Okay.
There were a couple of times in my career where I had to bet on myself, and contrary to popular opinion, like I never took on venture capital, never took on a private equity or hedge fund or anything like that. I didn't know about those things, frankly. I was naive to what equity financing was, like giving a piece of the company to an investor. We had a board of directors. I think I maybe went to 2 board meetings. Most board meetings happened over like a drink in my office and like in the hallways or the elevator. It was a fairly ad hoc thing, really, up until my sale of the company, my interest in the company. But there were a couple moments of history where I needed to extend more credit, and it just kept getting larger and larger and larger. There was one period where I basically did a deal with a manufacturing partner that would take on the inventory risk, right? We would take on all the marketing costs, and they would take on the inventory risk. And we found out by a vendor, one of our manufacturing partners, a guy named Carl, I won't say his last name, but a guy named Carl, who I remember faxed me. I was like, Carl, why is this coming in so expensive? Right? And I was like, that item should be cheaper. And it was just me just negotiating, like, damn it, like I want it cheaper. Because if you say I can't, then I'm not going to be allowed to do this. It wasn't because I was trying to make more margin. Mm-hmm. I just knew that like that item at a certain price point no buyer was going to buy it. Like it was not going to be able to be marketable, right? So I remember him faxing in after we'd signed up this crazy production deal that became very contentious and became our first sort of bout on the edge of bankruptcy, where he sends over the fax and he mistakenly sends over a price, which was the price that I understood it to be, and there's a separate price that's lower. And my agreement with the manufacturing partner is one price, and we split it. Turns out he was getting paid on both sides, the manufacturing partner. So that became the rationale to sort of explode that deal. Here we are on a surge offense. The business is taking off, right? Mm. The items that we designed with them came out really good. There's some of the stuff that holds up the best, even in terms of vintage, like the make, everything. But they're fucking us. They're fucking us. And this one agent who felt bad that we were getting fucked, and he kind of let us see both sides of the card. And that's when we pressed them on them. We found out from other vendors that that's what, in fact, was going on. And we ended up getting to like a crazy lawsuit. We almost ran the risk of either have bankrupt the business and or give the IP over, right? Because it was one of the, like, okay, that's sort of going from role playing to, well, what can you give me if you can't give me your money? I could give you my time. I give you my future money, personal guarantee. I give you my IP. I don't know. That doesn't sound like, how expensive is that? Giving over like the Rhino, my hardest working employee ever, my most loyal comrade. Like what? It seems like I don't know, mid-20s. I don't know how hard it doesn't seem hard. Sure, yeah. So yeah, you bet on it, and then next thing you know, like you're at the 1 yard line, potentially losing it all. And that those experiences, it was crazy. People perceive the ride as like it was. Just like, a lot smoother than it was. But that became a repeating cycle, okay? Which is, and you learn that macroeconomic things start to impact you. So where it came the hardest was when I bought, Marcy wanted to, she didn't like the risk portfolio we're taking on, okay? Remember now, probably at this time could have went to private equity, could have went in venture in retrospect. And probably would have been smart to distribute the risk, distribute the upside. It was a different game with Complex, right? Different offense that we ran. Just didn't have the knowledge to run that at Ecko. It wasn't because of greed. It just was like, just an absence of knowledge, right? Just didn't know that was an option, right? Let's start a business. Okay, me, you, and her. Okay, what do you get? I get 50, you get 50, you get 50. That adds up. Everybody's 50-50, right? Like, so that's how we were rolling, you know? So when we fast forward to maybe the part of the business where it's becoming in its maturity, we start expanding into our own retail, which is a totally different ballgame. Okay, this is, again, going back to building the mousetrap, the apparatus. I look back on it, and it's like, during the time, I was like, man, it was so fucked up. It was a house of cards, but like, actually, we built something really good, you know, and durable. Like, I'm really proud of like what we'd built, and I think we had 100+ retail stores, outlets, and full cost retail, and it was a very elaborate mechanism. We had multiple brands. At that time, we were no longer just Ecko Unlimited. We were doing G-Unit and Zoo York and Fetish and
Averex.
Yeah, Averex, like a whole bunch of stuff, right? We were trialing stuff, and I launched Cut and Sew, a brand with my own name on it, Marc Ecko, and that was like a whole another period.
We've talked a lot about the importance of identity and of brand, and you know, fairly early on, but after you've really done a lot of the legwork to establish the brand, you get hit with a cease and desist around the name Ecko.
Yeah.
And you're forced to change it. What did how did you and Seth and Marcy think about that? And, you know, in retrospect, how do you feel about what that forced you and the brand to do?
Oh, it's a good question. First thing I thought was like, oh, fuck, I can't get a break. I just got over this hurdle with this shitty manufacturing deal where our inventory was basically locked up because of this dispute that almost bankrupted us. Now we finally have our own season, manufacturing our own. I'm kind of catching a rhythm, you know, and then you get a cease and desist. And so for me, it was it was a company called the Ecko Design Group, ECHO, very long time predated my business, very validly in retrospect, made a claim that ECHO was too close, and Edward C. Hyman, ECH, the acronym Ecko, that had long been making polo ties and beautiful home furnishing, and even though it wasn't in the same business, I couldn't grok that in terms of the same classification. They had a predated trademark on our class of goods. So, and it was real. And so that was just like, I can't get a break, you know? So we just shot the ad. So now we have to like Photoshop everything out, change it for manufacturing. And I was so sort of stubbornly attached to the name, the spelling, because it was personal, right? My mother gave me that nickname. It's my name. That's as much as Edward C. Hyman can make a claim on ECHO, I could make a claim on ECHO. My mother gave me that name. I wasn't even thinking of you. So I stubbornly take that kind of position, and Seth is like, okay, calm down. This is me, the emotional artist, and the craziness he had to deal with me, right? The sort of irrational logic. Because I was okay to change it to ECKO for the packaging, the branding, but it was going to be Ecko by Marc Ecko, ECHO. And I tried that for about a year, and after that became more and more confusing to people. They're like, wait, which one is it? And I'm like, I'm making people adapt to the idiosyncrasy of my own sort of nostalgia for backstory and my claim on this personal righteous claim, right? Rather than the effective thing, which was like, well, no, it's ECKO. Change your name too, and then that will help bolster the strength of the IP.
You legally changed your name.
I legally changed my name, yeah. I legally go through the exercise of changing my name.
And that allowed you to own that sort of in perpetuity as well?
Yeah. It allowed me to bolster the strength of the ECKO mark.
Okay.
Okay, and it also, funny enough, in retrospect, like the things that are your struggles can be your strengths, and in this case, that struggle, which at the time felt like persecution or something that was unjustly put on me, was actually an exercise in good hygiene, exercise in better differentiating the brand, right? Because the unique spelling made getting the URLs easier.
Yep.
Right? So, but and I think I learned the respect of like the art of, we hit on this beat before of like there is a level of art and craft in doing business, right? Like Andy Warhol kind of famously quotes like the best art is business and making money, and it sounds very gross to say that, and people poke at that, but he was earnestly saying like what's interesting is how people actually orchestrate the complexities of a business to do things and create new models and expand in ways that you didn't contemplate. So that taught me about the importance of infrastructure, and that design and my ideas weren't enough. Right? You're not alone in this, right? There's other people lifting this burden, and that was a big lesson of humility, and also trademark law.
So, as Ecko starts to reach, perhaps not its zenith, but it has reached some ubiquity in the marketplace in around the turn of the century.
Yeah.
You become very interested in two pursuits outside of just apparel, video games and publishing. And with both, I think it's interesting that you stepped into them with a very meditated crawl, walk, run approach.
Yeah.
You didn't just immediately start publishing a magazine. You started with hang tags. And with video games, you started with the EA Madden deal.
Right.
Tell me, how did you sort of like think about that strategy? And, I guess did you have an idea of sort of what that runway was going to look like as you built these new businesses?
I didn't. Some of when you tactically, like Sun Tzu, like when you tactically take an inventory of the landscape and the territory, you only have but the situational awareness of what you could see in front of you, maybe the horizon line. You take into the condition of the weather, right? The climate, those locusts that sort of center on where you are. And I think a lot of the parameters that built constraints on my approach were because I was mostly busy with the other business. So what looks like a meditative thing was actually an extracurricular thing, like a side hustle that most people around me, especially on the finance side, although to Seth and Marcy's credit, never them, thought was like a dalliance and a distraction. So there was a forcing mechanism of gating because of my, we just had gotten through some pretty heavy risks. You just had learned through the bad production deal, trademark exchange, you gotta be calculated. So I think that was a forcing mechanism. But it came out of, the role playing. It was just RPG, like, all right, I want to build a fashion house. So when I would show up at Details magazine or GQ, and they'd bring the publisher, they rarely brought the editor, right? They rarely brought, and when they did, the editor was kind of like, okay, I'm here for like the meeting for like the ads, like hopefully I get the ads, and I'm like, well, are you going to place my product in the editorial? And it was always kind of a struggle, right? And it wasn't alone, it wasn't unique to me, right? Meaning Ecko Unlimited, it wasn't like a vengeful thing, but generally the cohort of that, my peers, Fat Farm, 555, eventually Sean John Rockaware, all these guys, like they kind of like the traditional fashion media kind of rolled their eyes at us. They thought we were corny. They thought it was just a trend. They thought it was actually ugly, you know, and urban apparel was like code for that's like stuff that like black people or poor people wear, right? Or like white trash or something, you know. So there was this sort of classism thing that I was encountered with when I would go place my media buying that informed my sort of revenge fantasy to say, well, fuck that, I'm going to create my own magazine and we're going to show, we're going to build the template, right, of what, how this cohort, this sort of, this band of misfits sees themselves, because we see ourselves as beautiful. And we see ourselves as creative, and we see ourselves as luxurious, right? And we see ourselves as daring and interesting. And if they're not going to say that we are, we're going to say that we are. And so that was just sort of my thing. I looked at the dollar. It was a very, actually, one of the simpler business bets, because I already had the mechanism of an advertising and marketing budget that was something like 10 or 8% of my total budget. So now that you're north of $100 million, it's not a little bit of money that you're spending on advertising, okay? And this is cash generated in the business, okay? You understand? Like this wasn't, this was the that $8, $10, $12 million a year was a material amount of money, and even that felt like being slightly indulgent. So I said, hey, Seth, why don't we create a company called Show Improve that was like a separate LLC, and we're going to take a quarter or a third of this budget, and we're going to conscientiously be more value driven on our media buying, but we're going to invest in ourselves in these other spaces. And the first one was climate, right, which was like what the magazine was going to be called, and then we couldn't get the name. They Mark. Don't have another ECHO moment. Don't be stubborn. No, it's climate. It's climate. I mocked it up. I had mock-ups. It's climate. No, it's not. The lawyers are like, it's... And we were using .coms were booming. So I would write, and you could even, like, I see people send me pictures of Ecko.complex. That was like, oh, that's so like 2000, you know? It's so like late 90s to like be like .complex, you know? And then we were in South River, New Jersey, where my offices were, the creative offices. One of my colleagues would refer to the building as a complex. And we would like geek out on that as like, oh, this is like the Mind Labs, creative, complex. Like we would just nerd out on that's who we are, you know, it was like an identity thing. That was our way to try to make South River sexy. People that were commuting from Brooklyn, which did not last that long. 4-year run, good years, really good years. And then we ended up in New York eventually.
Okay, and so you start the iterative process that ends up with Complex, and at the same time you start fiddling with a video game that would ultimately end up being Getting Up, which sells nearly 1 million units when it's released. I have to sort of, I think that from a marketing standpoint, the connective tissue between that and Ecko is fairly clear, but I'm curious, why is there only one Getting Up?
Oh, why is there only one? Because they're really hard to make. Well, first of all, I think one of the funner professional experiences, and sort of like for those that really know me and work with me, they know my sort of fascination of like new technologies and I think the color separation story is something like that's not a one-off. That's something that I don't know. Just I'm a big believer in new mediums and trying to just jump into the deep end on technology, and so when gaming became this sort of pastime, right, it became like a cultural phenomenon. I was there as a consumer of it, as an avid fan of the space. So much so that I would want to market to that audience. So I'd be buying, again, advertising against like PC Gamer magazine, whatever the different gamer magazines were. There were a whole host of them. PlayStation magazine. I wanted my ads to be in PlayStation magazine. I wanted them to be in GQ, right? I wanted them to be in Details, right? I wanted it to be in The Source. Don't tell me where it can and cannot be. That brought me to E3.
Okay.
And the video game trade shows, which brought me on the floor walking those trade shows. And I know trade shows. I've been at trade. I know trade shows. Okay, that's a big part of my story. So I felt really cozy there, and I would just bum rush those trade shows, like I would bum rush Jeff Tweedy at Spike's joint, and get to whoever was the most in charge. And I'd end up sometimes with someone who had a title that said CMO. And Chief Marketing Officer seemed to have some juice there. And I just had the good fortune at Electronic Arts that one of the more senior executives, a guy named Glenn Chin, who became a great friend, and he admired the brand earnestly, and I admired his brand. And he was daring, and he really brought that whole collaboration into in-game placement. And I was the beneficiary of being there early. That was a luck thing.
And you guys
too.
had the all Ecko team, right?
We had an all Ecko team in Madden. I forget even the year it was, but it was fucking awesome.
It had Be Real and Noriega and
all of De La.
Yep.
Rest in peace, Dave, and Jamie Foxx and Marlon Wayans and oh my gosh, Jason Mewes, Kevin Smith.
As a kid, that was a huge deal, and also a huge.
I remember I was with Fat Joe, who I love and respect, because he just doesn't seem to age, and his energy just. Mm-hmm. But he was a big supporter of the brand, and he's someone who was in a lot of our advertising campaigns, but I remember him saying to me, "Yo, Ecko, you went platinum with the Madden shit. You know that, right?" What? No, you don't get it. That. You gotta know, you just went, that's a platinum record, And I never had anyone say that to me like that. I guess, oh yeah, that was a big. Now, you could barely find the artifact of it today unless you have the game, but it was a part of the lore.
But it was also, I think, and to Fat Joe's point, it was a huge moment not only for you and your brand, mm-hmm. but for the entire culture, because video games existed on this mass scale that mm-hmm. was honestly different than anything in real hip hop music, not maybe Hammer or Vanilla Ice, but real hip hop. To have Fat Joe and Nori and Be Real and these guys in a video game that every kid across the country mm-hmm. could buy, that was a total inflection moment and a validation of everything that all of us were interested in at the time.
Yeah, man.
And I say that as late, I guess I was early college or late high school when it happened.
Yeah.
But it was holy shit, this video game has rappers in it.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
It was crazy. And I think that was a part of that sort of pioneering journey that, that was a part of that window in the culture when you were, I was just young and ambitious, and you don't necessarily know, you don't say, well, I'm pioneering, but you're effectively a part of a cohort that is in fact doing things for the first time. And that was a very special place to be. And I'm proud that the Ecko brand did a lot of firsts.
From there, you then go to making your own game.
Yes.
And Getting Up, where you play a graffiti writer.
Yeah.
And you gamified, the competitive sport of graffiti.
Yes.
To nearly 1 million unit sales, which is pretty remarkable.
Yeah, it's crazy.
What was that process like? And what was it like ultimately to have this game in stores with your name?
That was a unique moment for me, because that was a moment, a little bit of coming out from behind the rhino. I had, for the that up until those years, I'd say like in 1999 to 2000, I started to more conscientiously be ready to market myself as we renamed the company Marc Ecko Enterprises. And it was really my colleagues saying, you're too quiet, you're too reserved, like you should be out there, like, and I remember Seth, to his credit, and Rafi, who was in marketing, and Coltrane and Matt Fontana, all these guys, Coltrane Curtis, who's a very, very important part of my history, who's now runs his own agency at Epiphany. These guys were like, you need to put yourself out there. And they purposely took the Rhino and they shot a video, and they just took it like a printed board, right? And then they took the Polo Horse, and they took whatever other brands, and they did a cold polling on the streets of Los Angeles and on the streets of Manhattan. And they shot this video for an internal case making that people do not know who's behind the Rhino. Right? I know that, right? But then they'd hold up the Polo. Oh, that's Polo Ralph Lauren. And then they show a picture of Ralph Lauren or some random person. People will mostly not know who Ralph was, his likeness. Yeah. So I was making the case, like, it's a lot of burden. Like, this is a team thing. I don't want to do that. And then there was also this kind of, more of I was growing up in my aesthetic, and I wanted to maybe elevate, I shouldn't even say elevate, but maybe have a tangential way to express the brand through maybe stuff that was more discreet without logos and all this other embellishment. And things were changing, the market was changing, there was a preppiness happening, or like the woven shirt thing was like a thing, and people were starting to clean up and aesthetically. So I felt like, oh, the time is right. I had done some fashion shows under the Ecko Unlimited brand, and I'd gotten to be on the board of the CFDA so I was one of the youngest. I think I was the youngest at the time designer to ever become a board member of the CFDA.
Yes.
So the Council of Fashion Designers of America, sounds pretty douchey. Like, oh, I was the youngest board. Sorry if that comes off that way. But that was just like it was all
this all fit into sort of you.
It was like this sort of like stretching, and so the gaming became a part of that. And I didn't want to be boxed in, and I felt like if Ralph was building a lifestyle brand and world building, which he has, and he's been the best at it, then if he could do furniture, I could do video games. That was like my logic. Okay. If Ralph could do tufted leather couches, I could do video games. And that's what I would say to people in the gaming industry, and they'd look at me like, you just want a license, and they didn't want that. So I was like, oh, they need more. They need an idea. I'm going to show them I could world build. So for years I obsessed, when we barely had money to pay the bills.
And you talked about wanting to do things that Ralph had not been able to do. And one of those is to create a magazine successfully. So you launched the magazine with its original team.
Yes.
And fairly shortly thereafter, you end up pivoting and adding Rich Antonello and myself. Two people who, both of us came into it with a bit of a pedigree, but Rich was coming from the Nat Geo adventure world, and I was coming from the hip-hop world, but I was a child at the time, 25. What gave you guys the confidence to put this part of your business in the hands of us?
I think it was also Sansa, the landscape, the territory, the turf, the conditions. We were moving all the business into New York, right? That was an exciting sort of re-energizing moment for Complex. Complex was its brand identity from a sort of brand ID high concept buyer's guide was strong, but we were trail testing that from long distance from South River. So that move to New York was a really foundational sort of move for us. And when we were signing up for all those things that I say, woe is me, and I'm hand-wringing about, like the debt and the personal, the personal guarantees and all that crazy. At the same time, there's like the excitement and the exuberance of new. And I think it was the conditions of the space we were occupying, right? Literally and figuratively. And then yes, you guys came from, Rich came from Nat Geo, but he was a New York kid from Brooklyn that like grew up with hip hop, right? So there was it was just like the Bluetooth was syncing, I was making a video game. You guys were building Complex. It was super exciting.
You also at that point are really diversifying the portfolio. You
Oh
have
yeah.
Echo Red, you have G Unit, you have Averex, Zoo York.
Yeah.
That was it was a tremendous energy. To join that. I think Rich came probably 2 years before so he was in the old 38th Street office, but I only knew the 23rd Street office.
Right.
And to walk into that building with 6 floors filled with hundreds and hundreds of people.
Yeah, it was exciting.
I'm curious for you, you go from essentially, being in the driver's seat driving stick to now you are sort of in the way back of a limo.
Yeah.
What was that like emotionally?
It's hard.
Was it gratifying still?
Different kind of gratifying, probably the least professionally gratifying period, because you realize that like you don't have all the controls, which is a necessary reality. Like 'cause even when you do have the controls, you don't have all the controls, right? There's that sort of an illusion, right? Other factors that get in the way of life and business, macro conditions, competitive circumstances, supply side, whatever they may be, personal, interpersonal, human choreography, right? So, but that was the first time in my career where I had to sort of, I was being tasked to sort of put myself out there at once, but the level of depth of my touch was becoming increasingly lighter, right? So there was a dissonance there, right? As a creator, it felt there were moments of a mile wide and an inch deep, just because how do you fill up the day, right? Like your day, you were just doing so much that you couldn't possibly have the level of depth. And then so that sense of like being generative and feeling a sense of more deeper contribution into the equation, there was a dullness during that period. There were a couple years of a dullness. And then to make up for that dullness, I would go create other projects. I got into like, I created a little art factory, a little art studio, which was like really like looking back at that, I was like definitely, that was probably a breakdown of some sort. I don't know that I was ever professionally diagnosed, but there were some psychoactive drugs a part of that period that were helping me normalize myself. I think the highs of the soaring, and then the reality of the sort of distributed risk, distributed decision making, some consensus, making peace with being on, creating intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, some level of bureaucracy, understanding how bureaucracy, the mechanics of that, to both be a good thing and a negative thing. It was a deep learning period, dude. Like it was a lot to take in.
Well, I was going to say, it also felt like from within the building, things went from the pinnacle, from my first Christmas party, Kanye comes out and announces that he's going to do Pastel through through Ecko.
Right.
And from there to the G Unit offices getting emptied out on a Saturday afternoon felt like relatively overnight.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious, first of all, why did the Pastel Ecko deal never happen? I need that.
I don't know, you'd have to ask him. But I'm happy that it didn't, for him and for us. I think he was, he was really, to his credit at that period, he was like in deep learner mode, so he was just out there trying to figure out what he needed to learn to build whatever infrastructure apparatus he was going to eventually need. In terms of this,
But I don't want to get you. But getting back to this, what exactly happened in that 2007 to 2008-9 period that the business jumped off the rails?
Oh, there were so many things that happened. I think I think there were a lot of things. I don't think you can attribute it to any one thing. I'd say that the most catalytic thing was the financial markets crashing. If you remember, that was when I was spinning Complex off and starting to bring in investors, because Complex at the time was wholly owned by just me and Seth. So that's when we reconfigured the business there, and we were landing the plane on what the future of Ecko was going to be. You signed leases in 2005, 2006, and the 2007-8 financial crisis where the banks are going upside down. If you remember, this was when there was the big bailouts and all the
Lehman and all that.
So suddenly, where the bank meetings were like an easy thing, I was in advertisements for CIT, like a bank group, right? Like they'd put me in their ads, as like a success story. Next thing I know, I'm like the most hated person at CIT, So having confrontational meetings, just feeling the weight of what personal guarantee means when you're effectively upside down, right? It's basic math, right? You had more inventory, both of people, of product, and leases than you do market demand. Market demand is being affected by macro conditions. Some of them, most of them I think were macro, but some self-inflicted, right? So the cost of doing this and that, and the sort of maybe, it seems like we could sit here and like hold a trophy, of like, oh, Complex and getting up. And there were also good, risk reward, eye on the ball, right, eye on the prize. So there's some operative things in the organization where I think there were philosophical differences that started to show up. Some of those things of sort of adult, sort of professional divorce. People go through that. They experience that sort of, with their career. You have this idyllic perspective of what it was, and especially me and Seth, we nurtured we came up as teenagers effectively into this thing. We were babies. So going into adulthood and sort of that, sort of like, there was a very emotionally heavy business. In probably a very dysfunctional, maladaptive way. That if me and you were starting something today, we'd just be much more, we wouldn't have the weight of those basically
it's all
adolescent years.
Loaded.
So it was a very loaded thing. So there were breaches of all sorts. I remember distinctly feeling the weight of that, and also feeling just frankly tired. It does happen. Burnout's a real fucking thing.
Well, you guys were 18 years into the business or so at that point.
Non-stop, right? It was non-stop. And tired from the travel, tired from the expectations, tired from, explaining to the bankers why Complex made sense and why getting up made sense. And, I felt people trying to encroach on my creative ambition. And it was my creative ambition that got us to the place of success. And here we were, and suddenly I also took an inventory of the market, like from a market condition, because, it wasn't like the financial markets, the macro things weren't having an impact on everyone, including Nike and Polo and everyone else that was at the department store. Macy's themselves were all suffering. Everything was down. But man, urban was really down. And it just felt like, I really felt the dynamics of the distribution channels and their sort of lack, like that sort of doubt and that sort of lack of reverence for how serious we were as a category. we were the easiest young men's in the history of sportswear, and like the younger demo is the one that the retailers tend to be the most disposable with. They will just churn and burn. If it was the surf industry, and then it was later us in streetwear and urban, they just churned and burned us. They're like just because they're not like they were going to get rid of all the public companies that were funding, paying basically rent, because no one was winning. But we, in terms of resources, they were convinced that we were bringing them down, and they started just boxing out and slowly reducing the relevance of pretty much everyone in the genre.
So as this dust started to settle on your core business, how did you and Seth extricate yourself and sort of settle affairs?
I don't know that we did. It was very slow and sloppy and messy, with lots of yelling and crying and mean things said, and lawyers, and it was a mess. It was a shit show. Like extricate, fuck, it wasn't extricate. It was like some dismemberment. You know what I mean? It was a lot of blood.
But you ended up selling the business.
Yes.
And this was to get yourselves out of the hook of this
well,
debt
basically
cycle.
what we did is like the mechanics of it were Seth would partner with a company called Iconics that was a publicly held company. They were buying me out of my position, trading my interest into a perpetual royalty, and I would take Complex and we'd buy Seth out, and we would land the plane like that. So I was betting on that, and Seth was still very confident, and to his credit, he still had a go of it for as long as he could, but he kind of never recovered from just the how underwater the business was at the time. But the brand went on to, it's still to this day is it's owned by it's now a private company, but we're on our 30th anniversary. I'm working on a little like capsule for it. It's good. It's fun. Like I still love the brand. It's an important part of my history. I'm not ashamed of it.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is still. I travel the world. I still see it. I still see people wearing it. And when it comes to like, a gratifying, fruitful, generative sensation, right? For whatever reason, I still kind of get nerded out designing a T-shirt. So you're never too old to design a T-shirt, I guess. So it's still around, and we ended up landing the plane, but it was quite messy. It's quite messy.
You, in that divorce, end up taking Complex,
Yeah.
which at the time was profitable, but doing fairly modest revenue. Mm-hmm. And I would say, I think we both agree, largely on the strength of Rich's innovation around
Mm-hmm.
the Complex network.
Yes.
As a vertical ad network. We were able to scale the business out of the recession quite against all odds.
Yeah.
I guess I'm curious, sort of, in those moments of separation, when you were looking at Complex, did you have any idea that it could be what it would eventually become?
Yeah, I did. And I still, even being away from the business in any sort of operational way, I still look at my babies and my businesses, the problems that these platforms are trying to solve as relevant and pertinent, and there's always a path towards the problem solving. So I still remain sort of maybe naively optimistic about all of them, right? All the things that I've ever endeavored. Just when in game theory, and we sit around like, well, what could it do? What would we do it different? How would we do it? I always have energy for that. But I did think that it was going to be that it was relevant, and I felt and I saw and I understood the power and the might of the audience, and that there was an unmet need, right? From a demographic point of view, from a just overall content perspective. So yeah,
Well, to the point of your belief in that audience, I think one of the most important and consequential things that you brought to the table at Complex,
yeah,
was while we were building this digital audience that was real, but it was numbers on a screen. This inspired you to have the idea to birth ComplexCon.
yeah.
And this was a controversial idea within the office. This was scrutinized,
Yes.
and I can admit, to being skeptical myself.
Yeah, sure.
It seemed very scary.
Yeah, it was scary.
But tell me, how did that idea come to you?
You were also a collaborator. You also you helped it. You were scared, and people were scared for good reason, because they're it's not like I hadn't taken some swings and misses in my career, and I think that always sort of lingered for me. Is that as much as Marc could hit it out of the park, he could also he could put a lot at risk in his sort of blind crusader-like pursuit of an entrepreneurial endeavor. And I think it's funny, you start to, I don't know all the archetypes of entrepreneurs, but I definitely went through a part of my career where I was like more crusader than, let's say, driver, where Rich was more of a driver, right? I played later parts of my career. I think now I'm more of a team builder. I'm more of a team person. So I think, it's scary when someone gets into that kind of, that mode that they're seeing something, and then other people have other interests, and, we had investors, we had a board. It was more complicated. So it all had merit, the fear, but I also remember me and you sitting around brainstorming and thinking about the choreography of getting all the right stakeholders on board. This is a much well-lived and learned lesson from the Ecko days of not distributing the risk and getting the right stakeholders all technically distributed from a contract level through to really creatively, business-wise, on board. And we talked about, I was convinced to engage with Takashi because I had a good rapport with him over a year of back and forth. Let's do something. And then you were like, let's go visit Pharrell.
That's right.
And we went on the back lot of The Voice, and Mimi So very generously brought us into CP, and we pitched ComplexCon.
Yes.
So like I went from me to we, and that sounds corny, that sounds idealistic, that sounds like, but man, that's when the shit's at its best. So like I just kind of had that confidence despite the sort of inertia of people not wanting to either do more, stretch themselves, envision a new means of, like market making scary, right? That's what I've been my whole career. Is like I help validate markets, right? I try to make marketplaces organized where they don't necessarily exist. I see the seeds of pattern, right? And I try to help organize the pattern, and so you see that flock, and you see it's a flock.
So to that point, and also to the sort of your larger commitment to emergent technology that we've talked about several times in this conversation. I don't know if you remember this, but after we meet Pharrell, he says he's into it. You and I are headed to dinner to celebrate. And I look at you fucking with your phone, and I ask you if you're day trading, because I can just sort of like peek over your... And you're like, no, I'm buying crypto. And this is the spring of 2016.
Right.
And I'm like, I'm sorry, what's that?
Right.
and you explained to me Web3.
Yeah.
And
before they were calling it Web3.
I thank you very much for that.
Yeah,
because
thank you.
I promptly went home and downloaded Coinbase and bought some Bitcoin at $800
Right.
a Bitcoin. But I am curious, how did Web3 come onto your radar, and what was your fascination then, and what do you think about Web3 as we move forward?
Well, I'm just restless about wanting to about systems redesign. I think rather than sort of wring my hands and complain about the way things are, I believe there's a path towards solving a lot of our biggest issues just by making new solutions that are better. So if it was cracking channels, alpha channels in Photoshop and learning how to do color separation, or if it's saying there's got to be a better way coming out of that financial crisis, because during that financial crisis when I'm on the balls of my ass, okay, with a lot of public shame, right, feeling really bad about myself, selling my namesake, right, my friend and partner at the time introduces me to this crazy article about a guy named Satoshi Nakamoto, and it was all a reaction to the banking crisis. So I got turned on to Bitcoin and cryptographically designed stores of value, right? Because of the predicament I was in. Because I was getting so royally screwed by my banks, and that made me go down a rabbit hole, like a revenge fantasy of wanting to understand it. And I was doing gaming, right? And because of the gaming exposure to the gaming industry, I got exposure to be with engineers and technologists and people that could write code, and they were just cypherpunks that were into stuff. And there was also a part of the culture of gaming, right?
Mm-hmm. Totally.
I mean, I just said that, but it really, I remember getting introduced to Neil Stephenson's Snow Crash book because of gaming. It was game nerds like me that were into all of that, that genre of science fiction writing that informed, sort of foreshadowed so much that was going to come in our world, both technologically, politically, for better or worse, right?
Almost at exactly the same time that we are flying to LA to meet with Pharrell to figure out ComplexCon 1, Rich is concurrently negotiating the sale of Complex to Verizon and Hearst.
Yeah.
And that ends up going
in roughly the same window, yeah.
Roughly,
yeah.
I mean...
We were kind of in growth. We were in a persistent state of trying to increase our balance sheet to just go bigger. So from the Iconics investment to the first Hearst investment to the momentum in the field it seemed like that, we're talking about a whirlwind of some years there. It was 3 years. It felt like it never was done.
And it felt like the window was closing.
Right. There were macro things happening, right?
And I have to ask, the deal gets done. We all exit for $300+ million, reportedly, according to the Wall Street Journal. And you've talked about the shame that you experienced at the end of Ecko and having to deal with that going bust in a certain way. What was the sort of emotional payoff for you to then, 6 years later, put this tremendous W on the board?
Well, it felt great. I think the shame. I don't feel like Ecko was the Ecko business, how it landed, the plane landed, was something to feel shame for. I think the shame-inducing feelings have less to do about my ego or the pride of sort of ambition and skill that maybe left unutilized, as much as it was the disappointment with my friends and the people I loved and my colleagues, and sort of not feeling like I could have done better by the people that worked so hard for me. I think that was the hardest part, and the brand was still like at the consumer level. There was still, though not as feverish in terms of the scale, there was still a very loyal customer. So it wasn't like, oh, woe is me about that, as much as it was as like, as a person, as a creative leader, loyal to people that are sacrificing for me on my behalf, and that it was promises unfulfilled for them. It was much more of an interpersonal thing. Well,
I was going to say, on the flip side, I mean, with Complex, you did quite the opposite, and
that was gratifying. We could all win together, and it was a better distribution of risk and a better distribution of upside, and that in a culture that is driven on sort of radical independence, which is, the American way, right? There is something really powerful in the incredible feat of getting humans to organize, to do something together, and to do it against a plan. It's like one of the most gratifying things. Like, I used to make fun of watching Bugs Bunny cartoon and like the orchestra episode. And I used to think like orchestras, like classical orchestral music was so corny. And I forget who was playing the who's playing, is it like Elmer Fudd or something, or Daffy?
I think it's Daffy Duck.
Right, and it like the tuxedo keeps spinning up on his face, and it's like, I used to think that was just like, man, the orchestras are cool. Now if you actually analyze what's going on, I mean, as a metaphor, man, is it beautiful.
Well, I'm curious, because, with Ecko, you remained basically a three-way partnership throughout the entire thing.
Yeah.
With Complex, you and Seth invited Rich into the ownership early on, and then you and Rich invited myself and Moksha and several other key employees in. Was that move a reaction to how you felt things had played out in the first business?
No, I think it was just maybe a reaction to better knowledge. It was like in as much that, okay, I had an expanded scope of understanding of how you could create value for people when you can't necessarily give them money, and that there was, contrary to sort of my naive view of like 50-50, like what it was at the Ecko days between me, Marcy, and Seth. I think it was just knowledge, and it was also, again, Sun Tzu. It was like what the conditions. It was the right thing by the physical conditions, right, of the time, the space, the place, the business, the composition of the business. It was just the right thing. But it wasn't like, oh, I feel guilty, so therefore, it was like, that's how you should do business. And I try to share those insights with my kids now, and with people that I care about that are trying to launch things, that maybe can't necessarily pay someone what they want, but they want to work with that person at certain skills. Make them a partner. Well, people are really have a partner. Oh, is he worthy? And they start getting all self-righteous, why that person's not worthy, and they have idiosyncrasies. You have idiosyncrasies, motherfucker. You suck too, right? Like, we all, like, none of us are perfect. So how are you casting the team and like making the band effectively, right? And there is a certain intentionality of putting together that right balance of alchemy, of finding people with non-duplicative but complementary skill sets, being self-aware of what you're not as strong at. But just because you're not as strong at it doesn't mean you don't add value or you're not competent. It just means that, you rely on a different mechanism to make the machine go.
After Complex sells, both of us stick around for about a year and a half until the fall of 2017, and end up going our separate ways.
Yeah.
You entered into I went to an adjacent space at Def Jam. You went in a completely different direction, going to work at an NGO,
Right.
XQ,
Right.
and the Emerson Collective. What inspired you to go in that direction? And tell what do you do for them?
So the contrary to what many people perceive or what they know of me based on my Wikipedia, one of the many sort of domains of interest and pursuit for me has been philanthropy, and specifically the educational space, the high school space. It's been since I started making my first real money. So if it was my history of engaging with charity in, crazy to say it now in this world, but in Ukraine and with Odessa, with Tikva, or if it was sweat equity education, I have actually a history being in the space amongst
Also,
ed reformers.
The corporal punishment initiative.
Yeah, so the corporal punishment initiative, where I took on like physical paddling of students in schools, is how I ended up getting to meet the woman who was the Undersecretary of Education in the Office of Civil Rights, Ruslan Ali. Ruslan went on to become the CEO of XQ. So, people were like, how did you get to... I knew Ruslan for years. She's one of my closest, friends. It was like we were out of each other's world after I did the corporal punishment thing, which was I funded lawsuits against states that were allowing corporal punishment, physical restraint in schools. And I had some success. And when she was, in Obama 1 administration, she was a strong ally. She couldn't help me directly, but the administration was writing guidance on these topics, health and human services. So I found myself in DC nerding out on this and like really leaning into it, and became really friendly with Ruslan. And so I felt very lucky when she was launching XQ. She asked me to join the board at the XQ Institute, which is effectively a high school redesign initiative, right? It's a redesign company. It's like an oversimplification, but we launched with 20 or so schools that are all informed by a certain set of design principles. And we're really trying to make redesign open source and practical and available to districts and states. And and contrary to popular opinion, like if you want to see something anew, just because the system, you feel the weight of the system and you convince yourself that you can't, you actually can. And just believing that you can makes the difference. So like taking my professional experience of building market and marketing, I have felt that where I'm at now professionally at XQ, helping oversee our creative and some of our strategy and being active on there, and then being at Emerson Collective and running a group with great teammates, great colleagues in a group that we call the Culture Council. Being able to bring folks from outside of philanthropy to philanthropy has been one of the most professionally challenging and gratifying things I've ever done. And to sort of realize I spent most of my career about like myself, my own sense of authorship, my own like me, and like seeing the power of we, and being vulnerable to, and curious to want to learn, right? Like what better challenges to take on than some of like the most recalcitrant, challenges in the world. Redesigning the Carnegie unit. If we could, our time. It's why I went to join Ruslan, and very generously, like Lorene offered me to join. I was so eager because their vision was clear. I hadn't met people in the space that so explicitly said, all right, well, at the system level, at the unit level, how we measure seat time and the student credit hour and all of, like if you break that down, and we don't have time to do that here, but and for those that are curious, they should go to look us up at xqinstitute.org. But the system that was designed 100 plus years ago, very well intentioned by Andrew Carnegie, that framed the manner in which all of curriculum, time and space, how we procure curriculum, how teachers teach, how students learn, the orientation of the chair in the classroom, the shape of the year, 9 months or whatever it is, 8 months, all was established over 100 plus years ago. So it was so cogent and clear to me to hear them say, well, we have to redesign that very unit. And, I'm proud to say that through the years that we've been there, we're now in partnership with the Carnegie Foundation themselves, with them saying what we've been waving the flag on. So it's a very exciting time professionally. It's maybe not as, it's not as sort of much public fanfare, but I think it's as meaningful as anything I've done.
You've built 2 businesses that have reached ubiquity. You've raised children to adulthood.
Yep.
You are
working
now
on that. Work in progress.
You're now in the middle of your 3rd act, giving back.
Yeah.
If you were to sit with a 21-year-old creative entrepreneur, and you had 45 seconds, as we do in this moment, to impart some wisdom on them, what would that be?
My goodness, what would I say? 45 seconds? I'd just sit there quiet. Have an unnecessarily uncomfortable moment like this. Make them ponder on the ridiculousness of that question, as if it could be stated in 45 seconds. I would say, I'd say a host of things. I would say, be curious. Don't let, I didn't invent this. I don't know, there's some bumper sticker I saw somewhere, but don't let, school get in the way of your education. You have to be a lifelong learner. And I would say, know that you're not alone in every way, right? Especially when you're confident and you think that you're right. Even then, you're not alone. You're just being righteous. Like, be effective over being righteous, right? So your loneliness, or that sense of alone, that assuredness, that self-confidence of like, this is the way. Collaborating is powerful, right? Working with a team, distributing the decision-making power, being a part of being part of that orchestra, that thinking orchestra of problem solving, right? So surrender, be effective, stay hydrated with more than just, water and more than just tequila. Probably a little bit mix of both. Proportionally more water.
Fair.
And just tell them to love themselves, and that really it's not that deep. Really, it's not. Like, really, as much as we have all this. You should see this, guys. These people don't see that showed up here with 9 cars and all sorts of shit in this whole production. But like, we're just one little story together, and it's a really take that in, keep perspective,
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate you.